it's really a whole of society upgrade that we're looking at instead of just your vehicle that's getting smarter.
Hello, my name is Peilei Fan, Professor and Chair of the Department of Urban and Environment Policy and Planning at Tufts University. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I'm pleased to speak with Ray Ma, founder of TechBuzz China, and Lei Xing, founder of Xing and co-host of China's EVs and More podcast, about the state of intelligent connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles technology in both the United States and China, and areas of competition and potential collaborations. Welcome, Ray and Lei. I wanted to start by asking Ray with a general question about technologies of ICV, AV, and EV, their differences and their evolution in the current landscape in both countries. So my question for Ray is, what are intelligent connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and how do they differ? How do they differ from electrical vehicles like those produced in Tesla or BYD? And how have ICVs, AVs evolved in the United States and China?
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'll take a crack at this question, although I think Lei is actually the resident auto expert, and we work together on some auto-related projects. But ICV, AV, and EV, they're all kind of interrelated. EV is obviously electric vehicles, and that's an area where China recently has really excelled in becoming over 50%, I think, new cars are electric now being sold in China. It's kind of a leading stat in terms of global adoption. ICVs are intelligent connected vehicles, and they could just represent cars with intelligent sensors and any kind of network connectivity. They don't necessarily mean that the car is fully autonomous, which is what AV stands for. And I think for most people, their understanding of autonomous vehicles probably does come from Tesla, or BYD is actually not known for autonomous vehicles, but has recently started to roll out more autonomous functionality in their cars. But for, I think, both ICVs and AVs, once again emphasizing that ICVs spans a sort of broader definition than autonomous vehicles. They both tend to be related to EVs, right? Because electric vehicles are, if you ask Chinese manufacturers, they're essentially large consumer electronic devices, very different from the combustion engines we have had in the past, and they're much more easily adaptable to these technologies. Although I don't suppose there's anything necessarily preventing from a gas-powered vehicle from adopting some more advanced sensors and such. So far, we've seen most of the autonomous functionality be put in electric vehicles.
Now I would like to ask Lei's opinion about China's biggest EV maker, BYD, who unveiled its God's Eye system, a new car automation system that claims can handle city driving, not just the highways, for no extra costs on cars. So the bottom Seagull model is priced just a little bit under US dollar $10,000, and which is RMB, I think it's under 60,000 RMB. So according to BYD, it can drive on motorways for 600 miles without driver intervention. So my question for Lei is, how does BYD's release of this system shake up the innovation path for BYD and its competitors? What are the implications of BYD's success contrasted with the delay of approval of Tesla's technology in China?
So I'd like to mention two Shens and two Ts. The two Shens being democratization and standardization, and the two Ts being affordability and availability. So if we talk about BYD, those are the four keywords we put on top of BYD, and that's their competitive edge, right? So for the God's Eye system, it's basically standardizing and democratizing the capabilities of the vehicle, driving on itself with driver supervision, and they've standardized that at least 20 of their models. And when we talk about competition, when we talk about Tesla, which recently rolled out their FSD, those four keywords cannot be applied at the same time because FSD is only available on, I think, several thousands of the current vehicles, Tesla vehicles in China, because you would need the hardware 4.0, you would need to have purchased the 64,000 RMB or $8,800 FSD package. So if you look at the evolution of BYD the last 4 years, what they have done, in 2022, they stopped production of ICE vehicles. In 2023, they said they wanted their NEVs to be on par in terms of pricing with ICE vehicles. In 2024, they said their NEVs are cheaper than ICE vehicles. And in 2025, they're throwing in these higher levels of automated driving features for free. So for 4 consecutive years, BYD has been on this path of democratizing cheaper EVs with higher levels of assisted driving or automated driving for the consumers in China. That's how they've shaken up the industry.
Thank you, Lei. With the fast changing pace of the field of ICV and AVs, I'm turning to Ray to ask your view on what are the respective strengths and weaknesses of the United States and China in the field of ICV AVs.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that. And Leif, please feel free to jump in and add on any of your comments. I think that actually, at a very high level, in terms of especially autonomous driving, I would say US and China are sort of roughly on the same level in terms of technology. And in both countries, it's quite early in terms of adoption, right? So we see limited pilot areas. In the US, it's cities that have, or some states that have allowed for autonomous cars. But overall, it's quite limited right now. It's kind of in a pilot phase in terms of fully autonomous robo-taxis. Is what I'm referring to. In terms of other sort of assisted driving, right? Like what Lei was saying, that Tesla offers the quote unquote full self-driving package, which is not actually fully self-driving. That is being rolled out to more and more EVs. And we do see that, or I definitely expect that China will probably lead in that just because it has leading adoption of electric vehicles in the country. But in terms of the sort of individual companies that are providing these technologies, you definitely see more independent companies in China. In fact, you have three separate companies and Chinese companies that have either gone public or have filed to go public doing autonomous driving. And in the US, that largely has not been the case because most of the leading startup players have been actually acquired by either traditional automakers or internet giants. Whereas like I was saying in China, they have stayed independent longer. We'll see what happens to them in the future. And then you do also have a lot of the EV makers in China trying to make their own technology stack. Whereas, of course, in the US, in terms of a sort of a very viable independent EV brand, I think Tesla is the main one, whereas in China, you have a bunch more. So also the sort of focus, and I think this will come up later when we talk about policy and whatnot, the focus in the two countries are different. When you talk about ICVs, we're talking about intelligent connectivity in the vehicle, which is, lower in level intelligence than autonomous. China has done a lot more in upgrading infrastructure, right? So putting in a lot more thought and having a lot more companies and a lot more governments, local governments involved in making it so that the cities themselves are smart and connected. Whereas that has not really been the case in the US. And that really has to do with how both governments function and how they think about what it means to have a intelligent vehicle transformation in the country.
Yeah, if I can add 2 points, I think Ray alluded to two things that she said was multiple players. This is one thing that's different in China and the US is when you talk about Tesla, when you talk about a Waymo, there are multiple players in different links of the AV and ICV supply chain, fighting and competing. That's, I think it's kind of a strength because it brings the competitive and offering, it makes everybody better. And second is really just this top-down roadmap that China has, not only in terms of ICVs, but EVs. And this has been happening for years, right? What we want to achieve, I think it's more relevant in China than in the US. So those are the two things I want to add. Yeah.
Thank you, Ray and Lei. Actually, this is related to the ecosystem we're going to talk about a little bit later. But before that, I want to continue to discuss this topic and then to get your brain, your thoughts, Lei, about the export control and
Yeah.
sanctions chips and other material, as well as our supply chain management in this area. So my question for you, Lei, how will export controls and sanctions on chip and other materials affect ICV AV innovation in both countries? And also beyond chip sanctions, how are ICV AV companies in both countries working to build resilient supply chain, given the increasing
Yeah.
geopolitical tension?
Yeah, this is quite a difficult question to answer, but the simple answer I'd say is the export controls, if history is any indication, that these export controls have actually helped China innovate. We can mention Huawei, we can mention so far this year, what are the big names that have been talked about in the industry? It's DeepSeek, it's Unitree, and they're requiring less dependency on, let's say, in terms of cost, in terms of the chips, to offer the same, if not more capabilities in their products and services. So in a sense, I think some of these export controls have driven innovations from China, and in a sense, what's happening with the ICV and AV space. And I think that's I've mentioned quite a few names. It's more evident in the AV space where the export controls, let's say on the NVIDIA, is mostly affecting the training for autonomous driving. It hasn't affected too much on the components because a lot of these ICVs, which I refer to as something that you can buy individually, personally, they're often EVs in China, is that they are equipped with the NVIDIA Orin chips or the Qualcomm 8155 or the 8295 chips. They're still available. But on the training side, there's more restrictions for AVs. But I think the Chinese, they have found a way to circumvent these restrictions. And again, it ended up helping them innovate more rather than limiting their capabilities.
And the sensors too,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
well, China has some leading sensor companies, the LiDAR companies especially.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to divert a little bit to the consumer side and the policymaker side of this discussion. So cities must be ready for this industrial reality and also technology improvement of AVs as policy and consumers were very interested in knowing how will cities have to adapt urban infrastructures to accommodate autonomous vehicles. So this question is for Ray. Can you give us a thought about this and also like the reality of U.S. cities and Chinese cities of what they are doing nowadays to adapt to the technology development?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think a lot of this is still sort of theoretical, right? It's because we don't have any place where there are lots of autonomous vehicles. And that's what's really going to drive true changes in urban planning. Because if we're just talking about vehicles that are mildly intelligent, right, the sort of low level ICVs, then I don't think too much really needs to be done in terms of our infrastructure just yet. But I'll take a crack at the urban planning. I think some of them are very intuitive and obvious, right? If we do really have a lot of vehicles that need connectivity, then probably need upgrade in the data infrastructure, right? Especially better connectivity, 5G or even better, so that vehicles don't get they have access to data and compute and whatnot like all the time. And in that respect, I think it probably China is doing better in terms of talking about just basic infrastructure rollout and 5G. I live in the middle of Silicon Valley, and I think just now we saw my, right before our event started, we saw my connectivity go out. So we could definitely be doing better in infrastructure deployment here. Um, that's like on a very basic level. I think in terms of actual changes, well, what happens if everyone's cars are smart and, are driving themselves, and maybe we no longer need drivers? Well, we probably need less parking, right? If it shifts to a more vehicle leasing and, time share model instead of wholly owned. But what we may need a lot more places where cars can do drop off and pick up, right? So the street side or the curbside could look very different. Um, I think also if cars really become a lot more autonomous, then we will want to upgrade the infrastructure, right? It would only make sense if, the traffic lights, the pedestrian crosswalks, or whatever, all these become much more smart. In fact, some people have suggested that if we truly move to a mostly self-driving world, why do we really need traffic lights, right? Because the cars all presumably know what they're doing, and maybe they could all be connected to each other in a greater network. And we could really think of a world where there's going to be far less congestion, because every vehicle on the road could be potentially aware of what every other vehicle is doing, and could be potentially aware of all the pedestrian traffic, etc. So there's a lot of things that could be done, I think, that are very different. I think overall, if I had to say, yeah, probably China is leading in this area. You see some efforts at building smart cities, where there's a lot more sort of centralized dashboard, for example, where city governments can see traffic flows and manipulate traffic lights so that there is less congestion. I don't know that it's relieved it entirely, because the so far, until we reach that autonomous world, what's happening is that there's just greater urbanization everywhere. So the smartification of the city is probably not keeping up with the urbanization just yet. So there is still uh, a lot of very bad congestion everywhere. But I think in the US, where we have a lot smaller cities, we have um, local governments that are less well-resourced, and everything is more spread out. That's going to become harder to put in, right? I mean, personally, anecdotally, in my city of 100,000 people, uh, it would take a lot of effort just to change some, street lights. Sorry, not street lights, traffic lights. So yeah, I think overall there's a lot of, when we think about like ICVs and AVs, there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of business opportunity. I tend to look at it from a business or investor perspective to upgrade the infrastructure. So it's really a whole sort of whole of society upgrade that we're looking at, instead of just your vehicle that's getting smarter.
And then just quickly to add, China has multiple, many so-called ICV pilot or demonstration zones where these vehicles are being tested, but not of the importance of the vehicles, but the infrastructure. And that could mean how the vehicles communicate with the V2X, right? Which is actually a very important component of what an ICV is because it needs to communicate with the pedestrians, with the infrastructure, with other vehicles. So the way the technology base is a bit different. China tends to use more of the LTE V2X versus the DSRC communication than in the US. But it could mean roadside lights that has capability to communicate. The GNSS base stations, the Beidou navigation, GPS infrastructure. These we have much more of these in China than the US.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ray and Lei. I think the whole society really needs to adapt to this fast-moving change. My next set of questions are also regarding to the policy, but rather the industrial policies for both ICV, AV, um, and um, and then how that actually helping to formulate the ecosystem in both the US and China. So my first question is actually for Lei. Can you share with us how do policies in the United States, China, and also internationally shape the ICV AV ecosystem? Particularly, what are the data security laws and guiding regulations affect ICV AV innovation? The regulatory differences between the US and China create a competitive advantage for each country.
A great example is going back to Tesla FSD is because Tesla cannot have their data move outside of China and the other way around. So they have this data transfer restriction, which is a kind of a roadblock that has kind of hindered their rollout of the FSD. And that's something that they had to deal with. And Elon Musk, they're taking off videos from the internet to learn, to study, to be able to offer the capabilities, which given that the situation they're in, the past week or 10 days or so that it's become available, it's actually doing quite surprisingly well, right? So that's kind of one limitation. And then on the US side, there's currently not only 100% tariffs on EVs, but from China, but restrictions on the ICV software and hardware, which have specific date and time at which time they're not allowed in the US. So this could very well affect, Ray mentioned, there's the big three robotaxi companies, Baidu, Pony, and WeRide that are listed in the US, right? They have operations in the valley where Ray is. And more recently, you could clearly see that these companies are expanding their operations outside of China to regions like, Europe, Middle East, where they could work with the ecosystem partners such as Uber, that they can start offering these robotaxis in the UAE, for example, right? Right. So these limitations from both countries will have an effect on where these products and services to the global consumers can be offered and in what type of way. So that's kind of my answer to the question. Yeah.
So my final question for both of you is the outlook of the sector in U.S.-China relations. So for both of you, I want to ask what are the implications for U.S.-China relations if collaboration in this sector proves impossible?
The simple answer is anytime you have disagreements, anytime you have this bifurcation where you cannot collaborate, it hurts the kind of the US-China relations, right? This is a simple answer. But I think so far what we've seen, at least from the ICV, the AV space, it's not at the top of all of these factors affecting the China-US relations, right? Right now, it's the understanding, the investment, it's the tariffs, it's the issue of fentanyl. It's that's, I think, driving what I feel like was a lukewarm US-China relations just, I don't know, earlier this year to within the recent days, I think it has gotten worse, especially with the war of words that we've seen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and what Trump has indicated. But right, but any time you have this more bifurcation on the technology side, it doesn't help.
For me, I think that I am not that optimistic that there is going to be much collaboration on this front in terms of, yeah, ICVs, EVs, AVs, whatever vehicle we're talking about. That's because, I think both countries recognize that automotive is a huge sector. It is also critical infrastructure in many ways, especially to, the average user, right? We're not talking about necessarily military technology, but this is something that's ever present in our lives. And if there are, quote unquote, malicious code or technologies in these ubiquitous vehicles that we're driving, it could be dangerous, right? And cybersecurity concerns, data privacy concerns, right? When you have in-car uh, cameras and whatnot. With vehicle deployments, we already see that, for the example, in the case of Tesla, that it is effectively, if you want to be a player that operates in both countries, it is effectively going to have to be like a dual solution, right? You're going to have to play by the different regions' rules. You're going to have local data, abide by local privacy laws. China has special mapping laws, for example, and you cannot use global data in China or vice versa. So I do think that for EVs, AVs, and ICVs, I don't really see why either country with their very large markets and frankly, like world-leading technologies need to collaborate that much. It might be better if there is more collaboration, but I fully expect to see sort of this, yeah, bifurcation. And even with pure software providers, right? I think Lei was mentioning earlier, you have the likes of WeRide, which is a newly listed company. It's a Chinese autonomous driving company, but it has operations here. But you really see them having much more operations in China, right? So effectively, everyone is kind of choosing one market because it is very difficult with limited resources and talent to accommodate both sides. Um, yeah, I think it's just going to be
Yep.
another one of those technologies like semiconductors where there is effective decoupling.
Thank you very much, both Ray and Lei. We have unfortunately run out of time. Thank you both very much for today's timely discussion about AVs and ICVs and for sharing your insights on the future of US-China collaboration and competition in this space. I certainly learned quite a lot myself. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff who, behind the scenes, helped to make this interview possible. If you enjoyed it, we hope you will return for future National Committee programs.